Now it's time for the buried lead. That's what we call stories that we think are not getting enough attention. Today our focus is criminal justice reform. Despite so much division in the nation's capital these days, Republican Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky and Democratic Senator Kamala Harris of California are teaming up to combat what they see as gross inequities in how Americans are punished for crimes in this country. They say the process is often unfair to lower income individuals and minorities, while those with money and connections enjoy almost a completely separate and distinct justice system. Their first joint bill focuses on the issue of bail. The bill would offer states a $10 billion grant to help convert to a system where bail is set depending more on the risk of each individual based on risk assessments about behavior. The two senators say this is just the first of several laws they want to write to reform the criminal justice system. I went to Capitol Hill earlier today to talk with the U.S. senators about their work together. It's interesting that we're doing this today talking about a bill that you guys have come together on, because this is a big day for different legislation that you probably could not be farther apart on, healthcare legislation.
Correct.
Does that make the relationship on justice reform and bail reform tougher?
There are just certain issues that are not even bipartisan, they're nonpartisan. And on the issue of what we need to do to correct the problems with our bail system in this country, I think it's a nonpartisan issue. And I'm very proud and pleased to work with Senator Paul on it.
You know, I think what's interesting about it is we seem to be at each other's throats, and sometimes I think the media overdoes how much we're at each other's throats, but I think we're good friends. Kamala's new to Washington, but we immediately started talking about criminal justice reform.
Your home state of California tried and failed to move similar legislation. You were the Attorney General at the time, so you know how difficult this can be. What do you say to the critics out there, both in California and also I'm sure you'll hear from today in the Senate, who say if a person's accused of a crime, we should want them behind bars as long as possible?
What we have to understand about criminal justice policy is that crime is not a monolith. We cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach to criminal justice policy. And so on the issue of bail reform and the work that Rand and I are doing together, it's about recognizing that for some of the lowest level offenses, nonviolent offenses, the only difference between someone being in jail pre-trial or being out is if they can afford to write a check. And that's just not fair, it's not right, and it's not reflective of a system of justice that's supposed to be blind to who you are in terms of your wealth. A wealthy person should not have freedom while a working person can't, just because they can't pay for it for the same crime.
One of the things that affected me more than anything was the story of Kalief Browder. I was in the New Yorker a couple years ago. 16-year-old kid accused of stealing a backpack. He was put in prison with a $3,000 bail, but he spent 3 years in prison without a trial. That shouldn't happen in America. He tried to commit suicide. He was beaten in prison. It was just awful. And he eventually did commit suicide. That shouldn't happen in our country.
What happens in a typical case is the judge says, okay, I'm going to look at the bail schedule. Let's say it's $20,000. So who has $20,000 just sitting around in cash in their home? Most working people do not.
So there inevitably will be, if this were to pass, some instance where somebody gets out on bail because of this legislation or similar legislation, and then does something horrible. I mean, that just the odds are it will happen. What do you say to critics who say, look what you did, Senator Paul, look what you did, Senator Harris?
What I think it needs to be is to be individualized. So I'm not telling a judge they can't have bail. In fact, I think there are people who should be in jail with no bail. But it needs to be individualized. We need to look at each individual situation. So if you're caught in the act of killing somebody and you still have to have a trial, but there's a great deal of evidence that you killed somebody and could kill somebody else, I don't want you to go free at all. But the thing is, there's part of the Constitution that says we should get a speedy trial.
And Jake, you should understand that in our bill, what we are suggesting is better public policy, is that when that person appears before the judge, where the judge has to make a determination, let the person out or stay in pending trial, instead of basing it on whether they can afford to write a check, base it on an assessment of the risk they pose to their community if they're released. So instead, let's have a risk assessment policy where we look at objective factors, including the nature of the crime that was committed, look at their background, do they have previous convictions? And by the way, I'll say that on that point, it shouldn't just be previous arrests, because we know that in particular, African American and Latino men have a disproportionately high rate of arrest, even though they may not be charged with a crime.
And so the denominator is not race, it's poverty.
That's right.
But people are being treated differently. If you look at the drug war, Who's in prison? Disproportionately black and brown people are in prison for drugs. But if you look at drug usage, it's about the same between white and blacks. If you look at what's the plea bargain, if a white kid goes before or a rich kid, which sometimes is more white than black, what you find is they get a better plea bargain at every step of the judicial system. But I don't think it's overt racism so much. It has a racial outcome, but I think it's mostly poverty.
How did you two first start talking about these issues? You're new.
I'll remind you
That's right.
that back in 2014, when I was AG of California, you were doing incredible criminal justice reform then, and I knocked on his door. We had a meeting set up, and we talked briefly about what could be possible, and I wanted to talk about some of the work we were doing in California. But Rand, you've been doing work.
See, and I thought I was going to get a Democrat endorsement for my Republican nomination, and then she thought she was going to get a Republican endorsement for her Senate bid. That didn't work out.
He's joking. He's joking about all of that.
Yeah, but we did find commonality, and I like it also because it really isn't splitting the difference to come to a crummy product. We both, I think, have strong feelings on this, and they tend to overlap, and they're regardless of party.
Let me just say, I hear from my viewers all the time, why can't Democrats and Republicans sit down and find a common ground? And whatever they might think about the merits of the policy you're proposing, I think a lot of people will be very happy to see you two talking and proposing something together. Thanks so much for talking to us today.
Thank you, Jay.
Thank you.
Thanks.